Hi, everyone. It's Sir Robert Bryce here. This is the Power Hungry Podcast. We talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today I'm pleased to welcome back, for I believe the third appearance, my friend John Harpole. John is the president of Mercator Energy, a Denver-based natural gas broker. John, good morning. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Good morning, Robert. It's good to be back.
Now we're going to talk about fertilizer today, and John, you've been on the podcast before, but guests introduce themselves. Please give us a short introduction, if you don't mind.
So I've been in the natural gas business for 42 years, since 1980. In the late 80s, I was the natural gas buyer, one of three for General Electric. I used to travel 150,000 miles a year to all sorts of different GE industrial facilities. About 30 years ago, I started Mercator Energy. We're a natural gas brokerage company. We help companies like one of the largest nitrogen fertilizer makers in the U.S. buy natural gas. We help potash mines buy natural gas. We probably 70% of our business, though, is helping Rocky Mountain natural gas producers market and sell and account for their natural gas.
Got it. Okay, good. Well, you and I have been talking for months now about fertilizer and what the shutdown of fertilizer plants in Europe might mean. And it is becoming critical. It is clear that the situation is becoming critical in Europe. Let me read this to kind of prep our conversation. This is the Bloomberg story from August 25th. Europe's fertilizer crunch tightened after Yara International cut output in the face of soaring gas prices, putting more pressure on food supplies as a cost of living crisis intensifies. The Norwegian producer said it's further cutting its ammonia capacity to about a third, adding to a flurry of European fertilizer curbs and shutdowns announced this week. Industry researcher CRU Group, which I'll come back and talk about in a minute, estimates that Europe has now lost about half its ammonia capacity and 33% of its nitrogen fertilizer operations. The cutbacks by Yara come a day after CF Industries, which is an American company, announced it will stop ammonia production at its remaining UK plant. Akima AB, Lithuania's top fertilizer plant, will temporarily halt ammonia output in September, while Hungary's sole producer Nitrogen Muvek ZRT stopped output in early August. Earlier this week, Grupo Azoty, Poland's largest chemical company, also trimmed ammonia output, and Anwil, a unit of oil company PKN Orlen, halted production. I mean, the half of ammonia capacity in Europe, in some cases. What impact is this going to have, John? Because we've talked about it for months, and I've been meaning to write about it, but cut to the punchline. What is going on, and why does this matter so much?
Well, food security over the next 2 to 3 years will be the number one issue discussed, ostensibly based on what we see going forward. You got to realize that 50% of the food that we eat comes from fertilized crops. 50% of the worldwide food comes from fertilized crops.
And the fertilizer is made through the Haber-Bosch process, which turns natural gas into these fertilizers.
Well, there are ostensibly three different types of fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizers, which is what you just spoke to, natural gas based, potash, and phosphate. And so if you fertilize your lawn, you're going to see on the bag it's got three different numbers. Well, each one of those relate to either nitrogen, potash, or phosphate. So ostensibly, fertilizer is there to boost soil fertility and increase the yield. And so when we see less fertilizer in the marketplace, you can just categorically assume that there's going to be less food in that particular market.
Not right away, but soon.
Not right away. So again, the food that we're eating today was probably harvested 6 months ago, was grown and fertilized 12 months ago. And so the prices were these record prices that we're seeing right now on natural gas translate immediately to that nitrogen-based Haber-Bosch process. So, Robert, you take natural gas and you convert it under the Haber-Bosch process to nitrogen, okay? And that nitrogen then is upgraded to different types of fertilizer. You've got ammonium nitrate, urea, and nitric acid. And so when the natural gas prices started increasing a year ago, and I'm telling you, it wasn't just this war in Russia and Ukraine. That's contributed in a huge way. But a year ago, as we both have discussed in the past, there was a dearth, just a blank spot in wind energy in the North Sea. As a result, Europe as a whole had to switch to natural gas to fire electric generation because they couldn't count on that not so dispatchable resource of wind. And so prices started ticking up. And so even about, I'd say 10 months ago, CF Industries started looking at the natural gas price, where the number one cost to make nitrogen fertilizer is that feedstock cost of natural gas, and said, look, we're not competitive with our facilities here in Europe. We certainly can't export because our input cost is so high.
And I found some notes from last September. In fact, I think it was late September, so 11 months ago, when we were talking about this, and you said ammonia in the U.S. was $640 a ton. Natural gas is 60% of the cost of the finished ammonia. And you said, we talked about this, you said every commodity we can export relative to food will double in value. Now, this is 11 months ago, and I'm referring back to it, but this has been building for some time. And now we're seeing natural gas prices in Europe. TTF, I haven't checked today, $94 per million BTUs, roughly 10x the price of gas here in the United States. And the 1 year forward strip, or the 1 year forward price, is about the same as that, or even higher, right? So
that's the concern, the 1 year forward strip. And so the amount that you'd have to pay for a natural gas contract today for a year's worth of supply would be about $98 in Europe. Okay, $98 in Europe.
So
Here,
let me stop you for a second. So, but we generally quote front month prices, right? Which is what it would cost to lock in gas next month, right? We're in August. This is August 29th. To lock in gas for September, right now the posted price at Henry Hub or at TTF is 94. But in a year, if we want that same gas, it's even higher. It's $95, $98. I just want to clarify what you're saying here.
That's correct. And what's happened in the last month, so on August 1st, I pulled these numbers. That LNG price delivered to Europe, that TTF Dutch Harbor price, a month ago was $54. This morning it's trading at $98. That's for the 1 year strip. And so if you're a plant manager or you're in the higher ups at CF Industries and you're looking at the forward price curve and you've not hedged this in the past,
right?
There's a report done. Germany went out and interviewed 3,800 different industrial plants, and only 50% of those industrial plants in Germany, all types, not just fertilizer plants, but smelters, you name it, lighting companies, glass companies, steel making companies, only 50% of them are hedged. So for the most part, you've got to think that none of these people are really covered in terms of these current costs. So if a month ago, the 1 year price was $54, and everybody was predicting the complete shutdown of the fertilizer industry, and then a shutdown of the supply chains all related to fertilizer at $54. Today it's at $98. The U.S. price for 1 year is $7.70. And so that same CF Industries has about a $3 billion ammonia plant down in Louisiana on the West Bank, Donaldsonville, Louisiana. They're not a client of ours, but we have a client very near them that does the exact same thing. Their first quarter profit this year was 6x what it was the year prior. And that's because the natural gas price in the U.S., even though it's at its one of the highest levels it's ever been, is still, comparatively speaking, so much less expensive than what we're seeing in Europe and Asia, that they can make urea, they can make nitric acid, they can make ammonium nitrate and ship it abroad. So the stopgap right now for them is there aren't enough ships to replace what's being missed or not developed or not produced in the entire continent of Europe.
So I know there's been a lot of talk about, well, this is Putin's fault, right? But is it? How do you see this? My take is Europe sleepwalked into this whole mess. Tell me that's my bias. Tell me why Europe is in such dire straits.
My biggest concern is that people will look at this as an outcome of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, when in fact it's really political decisions that have been made by politicians like Gerhard Schroeder and Angela Merkel over the last 20 years. I've said before in my podcast with you that I think that this is the culmination or the beginning of the end, in essence, for this game, this chess game that Putin has been playing for 20 years. The dependency that Germany has had on natural gas from Russia was one of the benefits that they had in terms of the economy. They had a very efficient marketplace. They were counting on their number one trade customer being China of continued surging growth. And now you don't see the growth in China. You certainly don't see inexpensive Russian natural gas. And there are politicians in Germany right now that are very concerned about civil strife. I really believe that Germany, the position that they're in right now, whether or not they make it through this winter without losing natural gas for heating load depends entirely on the weather. They're at about 80% of what they need in gas storage, EU as a whole. But even in the past, at that storage level, they still counted on 100% of flowing gas volumes from Russia, and it's just not there. And so again, if you're any one of these industrial customers in Germany, and again, roll through it, pick your industrial customers, they represent 26% of the GDP of Germany. And yet they're not going to have natural gas. And so I think
those industrial entities, I want to talk about these in a minute, but these are smelters, glass makers, auto manufacturers, fertilizer plants, you name it. Any kind of manufacturing, almost any kind of manufacturing is going to have some gas need, and some of them are very gas intensive. But all of what you're saying, I'm reading back or trying to read back what you just said. Germany is the powerhouse economy in Europe. They built their whole industrial base on the premise that they were always going to have cheap Russian gas. And now instead of gas in Europe at what, $6, $8, $9, you're at $90 or $100.
And $90 or $100 for the foreseeable future, because Putin knows that you cannot supplant what he supplied overnight. Now in June, U.S. LNG surpassed pipeline imports from Russia. Okay, so U.S. LNG volumes into Europe supplanted pipeline gas from Russia, but you got to realize Russia was sending in about 15 to 20% of what they normally had. So we just can't put in place or build the infrastructure to build additional fertilizer plants, let's say, to solve that problem. We can't build within 3 years additional U.S. LNG export facilities, and it'll take at least 2 years for Europe to supplant what Russia was delivering by pipeline gas. It'll take at least 2 years to build the liquefied natural gas facilities. And so this coming winter and the following winter are a huge concern. I mean, what you're going to see in Germany is societal decay, period. And I think in many respects, we're predicting that Germany will capitulate somehow to Russia and say, okay, it's okay, you can take Ukraine. But the reality is, I think they already have, Robert. They have supplied less financial aid to Ukraine than the country of Estonia has. So again, the powerhouse of Europe, the industrial might of Europe, is suffering in a huge way because they walked into this trap that's 20 years in the making by Vladimir Putin.
Well, let's talk for a minute about electricity prices, because I was just looking at one of the, let me just call it up here real quick because I was just glancing at it. Right, the day ahead prices, electricity prices in Europe. This is on euenergy.live. You can find it. Austria, number of in terms of euros per megawatt hour, $725, where the euro and the dollar now at par. In Germany, in France, $743, Germany, $660. These are all 10x the price of electricity here in the U.S. I mean, it's not just, I mean, the increased gas prices are translating into higher electricity prices, but it's not, of course, it's not just gas, but what about the electricity markets? How is that going to affect European industry?
Well, think about it for a moment. The people that are most harmed by increase in any kind of energy cost, be it natural gas or electricity, are the low-income households.
Right.
So across Europe, low-income households, like they do in the U.S., pay a disproportionate amount of their income towards heating or electricity.
Right.
I saw one estimate that over 120 million people in Europe won't be able to afford their utility bills this winter. And so you're going to have the governments probably in each individual country step forward and expand any kind of low-income energy assistance program. But it's all sectors of the market, not just industrial and not just low income. All sectors of the market will be affected by this. What people don't realize is even 2 weeks ago, there were people, 10,000 people marched in Hamburg, Germany, in opposition to liquefied natural gas. And I told Lisa, I told my wife that, and she says, well, don't they get it? They're going to run out of electricity and natural gas this winter. Don't they understand their opposition to liquefied natural gas, all because of the far left green movement? It's choices that they made that one of your prior guests, John Constable, I think, put it best, that renewable energy is thermodynamically incompetent. It's one of my favorite quotes that I've heard in 6 months, is that, you can't count on the wind to be there when you need it, or the sun for solar reasons to be there when you need it. And so you need this dispatchable generation, which is coal, natural gas, nuclear. And as you said, 4 huge mistakes made by the EU. They shut down their nuclear plants too early. They shut down their coal plants too early. They relied on cheap foreign natural gas, and
overinvested in renewables and underinvested in hydrocarbons. I mean,
exactly that. And so I don't want the message of what that premise provides to be lost in this, it's all let's just blame it on Vladimir Putin. Because it goes much deeper than that. It goes to politicians who should not be making decisions about what's going to create electricity in their country. And I don't think that the popular poll of, hey, I believe in all of the above, should be the answer for who generates what electricity.
Well, let me broaden this a little bit, because there was another report just about to talk about other industries. This is some quotes from Grid Brief, my friend Emmett Penny's newsletter. He's quoting from some European sources. A company called Nyerstar will place its Boudel zinc smelter in the Netherlands on care and maintenance from the start of September until further notice. Norsk Hydro will fully power down its Slovalco aluminum smelter in Slovakia by the end of the same month. Boudel is the second zinc smelter to close this year, and Slovalco is the fourth smelter to shutter in the last year. And then there's the issue. So these are, other industries. And then waning flows from Russia I'm talking about Germany again, provoked the German government to acquire 30% of Uniper, which just announced $12.5 billion in losses. Uniper is the gas utility, which have pushed it to the brink of insolvency. And then I mentioned Norsk Hydro already closing their aluminum smelter in Slovakia. Is this the deindustrialization of Europe? And can it come back?
It is absolutely the deindustrialization of Europe. And again, I think it's part of the 20-year game plan by Vladimir Putin, just hands down. Whether or not it can come back, I think is best measured by what we've seen here in the U.S. under NAFTA. We saw the export of so much of our manufacturing. Robert, at the very base estimate of all of this is now a battle of globalism versus nationalism. I worked for General Electric, for Jack Welch. Jack Welch famously stated once that if you're going to compete globally, you have to source globally. Well, those companies that are relying on fundamental needs like natural gas from other countries are realizing now that maybe that wasn't the best decision. But what's stunning to me is, we've talked about this on the last podcast, that 7 different countries in Europe put in moratoriums or outright fracking bans for natural gas throughout Europe. The sum total of the population of those countries is 350 million people. And yet the only country that appears to be revisiting whether or not they should allow fracking is is Great Britain.
Right.
There's some rumbling in Germany, but you still have people in the streets that are opposed to hydraulic fracturing, that are opposed to natural gas in the midst of this, what can only be called economic chaos that's unfolding, that will be here for some time. So again, I'd look at this on a large scale as globalism versus nationalism, and then also the green movement versus pragmatism, quite honestly. And people will suffer the next 2 winters.
I've seen over and over these headlines that in Germany, they're tracking internet searches, and one of the most popular ones, or one that's soaring in popularity anyway lately, is firewood.
Did you see also, I think you sent it to me actually, that there's a 4-day queue at one of the coal plants in Poland for people that are trying to pick up coal to take it back to their residence for the winter. And I mean, can you imagine it's August and these people are anticipating the issues down the road? But think about this. So I'm Irish, been back to Ireland, half a dozen times. Ireland banned burning peat from the bog in homes in Ireland.
Out of climate concerns.
Climate change concerns. And so this whole argument about climate change and what's the proper approach, what's the proper perhaps economic approach to concerns about climate change is going to be front and center. But you're going to see this food security issue play out over the next 2 to 3 years, hands down. And whether or not those people will come back, those industries will come back, we can only speculate right now. But imagine if 26% of the GDP from Germany is based on industrial development. Imagine putting, let's just roundabout guess, 20% of your workforce in your country out of work. Imagine the concern now about the politicians have about social unrest. And if you're a politician, if you're Gerhard Schroeder or Angela Merkel, how do you account for the decisions you made on behalf of so many millions of people?
Well, and so let's explore that a little bit. So imagine 20% unemployment in the U.S. So that 20% unemployed people, they have fewer dollars to spend at the pub, on football tickets, on airplane tickets.
And higher energy prices.
The ripple effects through the entire economy then degrade the rest of the economy, not just that one sector. Is that fair?
I think it's absolutely fair. And again, people don't understand the supply chain issues that are related to all chemical factories in Europe, not just fertilizer, but all the downstream customers of those chemical factories who will not have access to that material to produce their own product.
I think that's a key point because the interrelated nature of the chemicals and petrochem industry. A quick vignette: a friend of mine works for Shell Oil in Shell International, Royal Dutch, in Texas. And during the blackouts, during Winter Storm Uri, the company they have a refinery and they have their own cogen facility, and their electric prices were high, and they wanted to restart the power plant. And they couldn't do it. And why not? Because before they restart the gas-fired power plant, they have to purge the lines with nitrogen, something that's not flammable. Well, they couldn't get the nitrogen because the company next door that was producing the nitrogen, it was shut down. So the interconnected nature of these different industries is something that I think as well as underappreciated. And so the network or the industrial network is so closely intertied that if one part of it falls, then it's going to pull down other parts. Does that rhyme with what you know?
Absolutely. Imagine the car industry in Germany, one of their bulwark industries. I heard from a Ford dealer that there are as many as 159 microchips in every Ford F-150. Imagine the supply chain issues, not just microchips, but imagine the supply chain issues related to all the plastics that are in a car that are derived from natural gas ultimately,
right?
Where natural gas is converted to a downstream product that ultimately winds up being plastic. I mean, the plastics for GE was one of my biggest clients. There were facilities across the country that I supplied to, and Robert, I really didn't understand the interconnectivity of all of this and the supply chain issues until I started walking around and seeing all the GE plants. It was quite an education, but I think the world as a whole is about to get an education about the interconnectivity of all these different disparate industries that don't seem related, but are quite honestly very connected.
One of the things I'm just looking as we're talking here at this euenergy.live website on the day ahead prices for electricity in Europe, what jumps out is Poland. And Poland their prices are $300 a megawatt hour for the day ahead market, whereas in Germany they're twice that, $660, in Austria $725, in France $743. I see that and I think, why is it lower? Because Poland uses coal. And it's domestically supplied. Is that your read as well?
Absolutely. I mean, think about the Poles. You've got to hand it to them. There was no concerted effort to assume all the immigrants in from Ukraine. They were taken into the household of Poland. Think about it. I mean, they're aware, and think about these are the people that are smart enough in August to queue up for coal in advance of this winter, knowing that this card is going to continue to be played where where natural gas and oil are a weapon of the Soviet Union, of the former Soviet Union, of Russia.
Right.
They get it. They understand it. They're pragmatic. So, yes.
And they have a long history with Russia and all of its bad.
And their expectation is probably dead on for what's happened here. How Germany walked into this thing will be one of the great questions of this century, I believe. I heard one German op-ed, and this, why was Germany so pro far green left in terms of their choices on energy? And this one op-ed writer indicated that young Germans felt that they ruined the last century with World War II, with the whole Nazi effort. And so it was their ache to supply a solution to this century by pursuing and trying to save the world from climate change. I can't really delve into the motivations of some of this stuff, but people are going to get a hard lesson, and you're going to see the far green left say, oh, this is the very reason why we need to leave hydrocarbons. But it's a suicidal effort, I think, in terms of the economy. And Germany's front and center. And what, this Inflation Reduction Act here in the U.S., you'd think that the United States would learn from the mistakes being made that have been made on energy choices in Europe, but it appears to be lost on deaf ears, at least in this administration.
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to talk too much about the left, but it does seem like the continuing to push these radical decarbonization efforts at the very same time that Europe is in, as my cousin Bryce Edwards said, deep yogurt. He's a Wisconsin guy. So, but it just seems almost the lack of understanding, the lack of appreciation for the danger that lurks here is really remarkable. But let me jump back to the fertilizer issue here, because you had a good statistic on the four main forms of grain and what they constitute in terms of overall food availability around the world. Can you run those numbers again for me, John?
So there are four main grains or four main commodities that 65 to 75% of the caloric intake of the world is predicated on it comes from these four grains. And it's wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans. So without wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans, the world would starve to death. I've seen estimates, Robert, of how many billion people are there in the world right now? 8 to 9 billion.
7 or 8, something like that.
3.5 billion people are here only because of the discovery of the Haber-Bosch process that allows you to make man-made nitrogen. Before 1910, 1915, the only source of nitrogen was bat guano from South America.
Bird and bat guano, yeah.
Yeah, so Haber and Bosch came up with this way to synthesize nitrogen, and 95% of the nitrogen produced in the world right now comes from natural gas. So they're inexorably linked, the price of natural gas and the price of nitrogen, urea, ammonium nitrate, and nitric acid. And so when you see the entire closure of a continent's supply effort for fertilizer, you recognize and realize, okay, if 20 to 30% of the yield that we get from those four grains is increased only because of fertilizer, without fertilizer, you're going to see a 20 to 30% drop in the downstream supply of food. And that's, in fact, what we're going to see in West Africa this winter. That individual farmers are supply the majority of food to West African countries. So pick Ghana as an example. Now, Ghana may rely on potash supplies from Russia to the tune of about 40% of their needs, but they cannot fertilize their product, their soybean, their corn, their rice, or their wheat. And so there's going to be a 20 to 30% food shortage in Ghana this winter. And next spring, probably be worse in 2023.
Well, you say that, and I've talked to one of the guests I've had on the podcast was Doomberg, who's done some really amazing work, and I've heard other people, but this is the real prospect of famine, and it's such a. I mean, I hesitate to even talk about it because it's such a dire. I mean, the word itself is so just there makes me something inside me cringe, but there are prospects like Jordan Peterson. The other day, I heard him on a podcast saying there's some estimates that 1 billion people could die. I mean, this just the numbers here are so scary. It's hard to even repeat them because it's so awful to consider. But have you run those numbers? Is there any way to do some kind of estimate about what this could mean in terms of loss of life?
Well, imagine, let's say, again, I should know this number of 8 or 9 billion people. Imagine having 10 to 15% less food. And so who's always last on that list in terms of food? And that's the poor, or
Right.
the poorest countries, or the poorest countries who can't supplant and help their local farmers pay for the kind of fertilizer that they're talking about. But when I see this food security issue, the derivation of all of this are poor decisions being made by politicians upstream of that issue.
Yeah.
And I point directly at Germany. So because of poor decisions made in Germany, people are going to starve to death in Central Asia and North Africa, West Africa.
Well, and you've talked about this in one of the most popular podcasts we've done is the one you were on, I think, in March. And we talked about this at length about how Putin set the trap and that a lot of the anti-fracking efforts in Europe were, in fact, funded by the Russians. And this has been shown over and over. And again, this is one of those things that I thought, oh, come on. When I first thought, I thought, oh, this, but they've driven themselves right into the ditch. Well, let me ask this question because I've talked with other people about what Europe needs to do, right? And clearly they need to start drilling, right? That this is an unpopular thing to say when you talk about climate change, but if they're going to get out of their butt out of the ditch, they're going to have to start producing more of their own hydrocarbons. So let's assume that Britain called off the frack ban. They repealed the frack ban because Britain, apparently their shale resources are quite large and they have an enormous amount of potential. The same with Germany and same, I understand, with France. If they repealed the frack ban and you had available rigs, frack spreads, roughnecks, rigs, all the things that you need, how long would it take for Europe to begin producing significant quantities of gas to meet their own, how long would it take Europe as a whole, or pick your country of your choice, how long would it take them to start producing significant quantities of gas that could help alleviate this crisis?
Well, and with all due respect, the premise that there's available rigs and rednecks is a fantasy right now. If there were available rigs and rednecks, it'd take 2 to 3 years. But as
I should say roughnecks. Rednecks, roughnecks
we
might
love
be rednecks, but not.
And I know you're from Oklahoma, so
I am from. These are my people.
they
not all rednecks are roughnecks, but all roughnecks are rednecks. I don't know.
Think about it this way. Okay, June, we actually supplied more LNG to Europe than there was Russian natural gas flowing. Where would the world be right now without the U.S. shale revolution, without those rigs and roughnecks? Yeah. Think about that. We thought 20 years ago that we'd have to import about 20% to 25% of our natural gas needs from overseas. More likely, it would have come from Russia. And so everything that you've seen in this 20-year effort by Putin is just a KGB type plot that sounds worthy of a 007 movie, and that's why it's so easy to dismiss it. But this guy literally went out and spread disinformation on fracking. He did it in Europe. We know he spent $95 million in Europe. They bought onto it. But what's stunning to me, and that's why you ask, how long will it take to correct this? None of those 7 countries have lifted the moratorium on fracking. Had they pursued the same kind of shale revolution that we did here, they would be energy secure on their own soil with their own natural gas supply.
And we wouldn't be talking about this.
Right. And so I think there's going to be so much loss.
And that is remarkable, is that even with TTF, the Dutch trading hub, at $94 per million BTUs, 10 times the price of gas here in the U.S. right now. And in the U.S., remember, it was just 2 years ago, it was at $2, right? So we're at nine, almost 10. But even in the face of this carnage, they're not repealing the frack bans. I mean, that on its face is really remarkable. What are they thinking? Get busy, man, right?
People will die on the doorstep of their far left save the climate environmental religion. People will die, and people will die in vast higher numbers in Africa than they will in Europe because of decisions that Europeans are making. That's not an overstatement.
Well, and
That's a
it's not
direct
just, and
causal
it's,
event.
and the disruptions aren't just in the fertilizer market, right? Because Ukraine and Russia were both big grain exporters, right? And so now that supply of grain to the world market has been cut off as well. So it's I mean, to zoom back for a moment, that's really the big picture here in terms of the double whammy, triple whammy in terms of global food supply is immediate loss of availability of grain, and then the future loss of availability of grain because of the high fertilizer price. Is that how you see it?
Yes, it is. And I don't think that historians 30 years from now are going to be very kind on the decisions made in Germany and Europe.
Mm.
They're just not. You're going to look at Germany 30 years from now, I believe, the same way we did growing up, in the 50s and 60s, the way we looked at Germany during World War II. Now, that's a strong statement, but I think when you
Ouch.
go back and really look at it, you think, oh my gosh, the choices this country made that impacted the rest of Europe and the world started in that country.
And how could they have done this?
How could they do that twice? Two different issues, but they've done it twice now. How could Gerhard Schroeder, 3 months after he left as Germany's chancellor, take a job with Vladimir Putin's Nord Stream 1?
Yeah.
When Nord Stream 1 was proposed, Robert, it was proposed to bypass all the Balkan states, so you didn't have to pay a transit fee to the Balkan states if you're Russia to
Right.
get gas to Western Europe. When Nord Stream 1 was proposed, the Italian prime minister came out and said, and it was prophetic, said, once again, Germany and Russia are dividing up Europe.
Mm.
That's when Nord Stream 1 was built, not 2, but 1.
And this would be 2008, 2007, something.
2007.
Yeah. Yeah.
How prophetic.
Well, let's jump back to the fertilizer thing. I mean, there's so many things that are connected here. But if people listening aren't familiar, there's a group out of Europe called the CRU group, and you can log in and register on their website. And they have a lot of data on ammonia and I guess what would be the equivalent of crack spreads for ammonia. But you can find it. It's crugroup.com. But their website shows that right now, today, August 29th, that the margin for producing a ton of ammonia is negative $1,500 a ton. For urea, it's negative $1,200 a ton, and ammonium nitrate is a negative $700 a ton. So they're publishing numbers that saying that show why so many fertilizer producers are going out of business is that they can't afford the more money or the more product they produce, the more money they lose. So of course they're going to shut down. I don't know if you had a chance to look at those numbers, but man, that is just stark.
You go back to it, 60 to 70% of the cost of nitrogen fertilizer is the input cost of natural gas.
Right.
You're converting that natural gas to fertilizer. And so many of those facilities, the best ammonia plants are really located on water where you can export. And so they realized, honestly, Robert, probably 8 months ago, that the ammonia that they would make in Europe could not compete globally, purely because of natural gas costs. About a year ago, well, let's say October of last year, the natural gas cost, I think, in Europe was about $35 a unit, whereas here in the U.S. at that time it was 4.5.
Right.
So immediately, let's say if 40% of your profit is made because you produce ammonia in Europe and you export it, 40% of your profit is gone. And so those plants that were kind of on the margin were shut down. And now the death kill moment is to look at, my gosh, look at this 3-year price right now is over $70. We will never be able to.
So stand by. So let me just drive that home. So we've been talking about the front month price right now in Europe at TTF's 94. The year ahead price is 97 or 98, and you're saying the 3-year price
is
for
over
for TTF
is north of $65.
Wow.
So and imagine then carry that back to not just fertilizer, but all of Germany's industrial complex. Only 50% by this estimate of 3,800 3,800 different facilities were interviewed in Germany about a month and a half ago. Only 50% of them had covered their forward energy cost. Well,
so
as you
they're
step into
they're
the
naked
next 6 months,
in trader terms, they're naked.
right?
They're
They're negative. And
They haven't
6 months from now,
hedged
Robert,
they haven't hedged their forward energy price risk, and so
correct.
they're having to pay spot price, and the spot price has nearly doubled in the last 4 weeks.
So 6 months from now, you can speculate and guess that none of the industry in Germany will have any kind of energy hedge in place because prices are so high.
And they
So
can't,
there's no
there's a cost for hedging, right? Because you're going to have to put some money
time
in,
value money.
right? Well, right, but they're going to have to put up earnest money. I'm not a trader. But you have to, if you're going to buy that hedge for a year from now, you have to put cash on the table, right? I mean, what is
You
that?
have to have you have to have a letter of credit with a counterparty that covers your exposure for that entire time period. But my point is this, that there is no commodity that's made in Europe that has a higher price right now than the input cost of natural gas to make that commodity. So industry as a whole shuts down. You can't sell aluminum for your European-based natural gas price. And so you got to realize for most of these industries, their energy cost is one of the top three costs that they have. This is no different than my General Electric days.
Right.
You go to GE Lighting, their number two cost was natural gas to make glass, to make light bulbs.
Right.
And so if energy is one of your top three costs, the highest energy cost you've ever seen that's forecast to be there for at least 3 years wipes you out when you run the numbers on whether or not you can make your little widget based on that energy cost.
So the more they make, whether it's aluminum or whatever it is, the fertilizer, they can't make a profit at these numbers.
And what's stunning is probably the continent that pursued globalization, the EU pursued globalization more than anyone, is now going to die on it because they can't export. They can't export, which kills the fundamental economics of what they've got there. And so this whole 20-year effort by Putin is to sow disunity in the EU.
Well, let me press you on that, because as I've thought about this over the last few days, I thought, okay, well, so Putin doesn't want to kill Europe totally, right? Because if he does, then where's he going to sell his oil and gas?
China.
Okay, well, fair enough. So he's selling a lot to India, selling a lot to China, but it's a codependent relationship, right? Who the buyer? Who owns who? Is the buyer own the seller? Does the seller own the buyer? So
but it was that philosophy that Germany pursued that hold your competition close,
right?
That did them under.
Well, but from a strategic longer term situation or standpoint, wouldn't Putin be wiser to not kill Europe completely, right? To keep them alive a little bit and make sure that keeps them on the hook, that they can't transition solely to U.S. gas, that, oh, well, we want to make sure we keep this customer going because then we can assure the future revenue. Is that it?
The premise of that is that somehow he's making less money on his oil and gas right now than he was before. And I would argue that he's making more.
Right. Yeah. I've seen those estimates.
So let's say he's only selling 15% of what he did before. It's at 8 to 10 times the cost of what it was before.
You know, there was one other number that I want to toss out here because to me it's such a remarkable one that I think it was a writer for The Economist. I don't have it at hand, but he tweeted this out the other day that Germany's natural gas costs traditionally had been less than 1% of GDP. This year, it's going to be 8.4%. The cost of natural gas into the German economy will be 8.4% of total GDP. I mean, it's just a gobsmacking number.
I think it was John Constable that talked about the societal choices that we make here in the U.S. to go invest in renewable energy. And quite honestly, that's money that could have been spent somewhere else, probably in a better fashion.
Right.
You know, to help the economy. Think about 20 years of those decisions, and then think about the impact that's going on right now. This is a pure result of choices made by politicians.
Yeah.
That I think were driven to positions by far left green groups that then don't have to live with the consequences.
Well, you know, as you say that, one of the things that jumps in my head, John, is that the difference is that when the renewable push happened here in the United States, it happened at almost the exact time of this shale revolution. That didn't happen in Europe. There was no growth in shale oil and shale gas in Europe. There was only growth in renewables. And so that seems to me one of the key differences is that the government there could constrain the growth of hydrocarbons, whereas in the United States, they really couldn't. And in fact, the growth of the shale revolution enabled a lot of the policies that Obama wanted to put in place. And I'd argue even the same with Biden about the Clean Power Plan would never have been feasible with natural gas at $8 or $10. But when it fell, then, oh, well, sure, we'll shut down coal plants and replace them with natural gas. Now, that's not proving to be such a good decision now, given that our gas and electric markets are so closely tied in the U.S. But I guess what I'm saying is that the U.S., we could afford some bad policy because we had all these other things going on, whereas Europe couldn't. Is that how? Is that
so? Absolutely,
and that makes sense to you?
And I've had a hard time trying to put this into words, but low natural gas prices that resulted from the shale revolution helped mask the real cost of the choice of renewables at the residential utility level.
Yeah.
And so it really hit. So when natural gas prices came off, the pain that you saw in writing your monthly utility bill was not as painful as it would be because natural gas component of that whole electric cost was so inexpensive, relatively inexpensive. So it really masked the true cost of these choices we're making on renewables. Europe did not have that. Europe didn't have the shale revolution.
Right.
Europe couldn't hide the true cost of renewables. So in many sense, people would say that they're 7 to 8 years ahead of us on renewables, but they didn't have the benefit and the cushion of cheap natural gas.
Right.
And they certainly don't have it now.
Yeah.
Because they're not getting it from Russia.
Well, and some of the year ahead prices, I was just looking, Javier Blas from Bloomberg, I think it is, had a tweet this morning that the year ahead prices for power, for electricity in Germany are now at $1,000 a megawatt hour. I mean, these numbers just, I've seen these lines eye-watering, and they're just flat shocking. $1,000 a megawatt hour, that's $1 a kilowatt hour. I just calculated my own utility bill here in Austin. I'm paying last month, this summer here, it was less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And residential averages across the U.S. are about 14 cents. So, I may need to do my own calculations on my own residential bill here again because that number seems too low to me. But $100, $1 a kilowatt hour and that's the wholesale price for residential electricity. That's just a crazy number.
Robert, if I can, we're good friends. I want to turn the table and be the interviewee.
Okay. Here. Interviewer, you mean? I'm the interviewee. Okay.
Interviewer. Don't you think that your position, and I want you to tell everybody about how there really isn't any energy transition going on right now, but don't you think that Putin understood that for the last 20 years?
Well, I've looked at I study the BP data, the BP statistical review. You know how much wind energy Russia has installed? Effectively zero. None. And it's a vast country with a lot of wind, a whole lot of empty territory. I'm sure they could cover Siberia with wind turbines. They haven't done it.
And instead, he probably celebrates that other countries have.
I can't say that, but what Russia has done is they've developed their nuclear sector and continued to develop it, and they've stolen a march on the U.S. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to interview me, what would I say? I would say, well, I talked about all this last November, and when I testified before the Senate, not bragging here, but Natural Resources Committee, I said, well, don't do what Europe did, and what has Europe done? Overinvested in renewables, underinvested in hydrocarbons, shut down their baseload coal and nuclear plants, and relied too heavily on imports. And this unfortunately is what appears to me to be the push, even under this the Inflation Reduction Act. Overinvestment in renewables. And there's some good things in there for nuclear. Let me be clear, about $30 billion, but it's not nearly enough. In my view, we've got to get serious about nuclear, and we're not. And there's some positive movements there. And one thing that I thought was interesting, and I don't know if I shared this with you, but to me, it's really interesting. And I'm going to write about it and talk about it. Dow Chemical just announced they plan to build SMRs on some of their Gulf Coast petrochemical plants. And that's big deal. A very big deal, because here you have an old line industrial firm saying, you know what? We love natural gas. We're going to keep using natural gas, but for process heat, for electricity, we're going to turn to small modular reactors. I think that's really, really important.
I had not heard that. I had not heard that at all. But I think for your listeners, the one takeaway that I hope they get from this chat is that this is not solely related to Russia attacking Ukraine, the position that Europe is in right now. It's just not. It's a bunch of other decisions. And if I'm the far left green climate change folks, I want to try to spread as much disinformation as I can about this is all and only related to Russia attacking Ukraine. There are much, much, much larger decisions that have been made over the last 20 years that will result in insecurity related to food for the next 3 years, where again, tens of millions of people may die because of those poor energy choices made by the Europeans over the last 20 years. I put it directly in their court.
Yeah. Let me ask that question again, John, because I just want to make sure that I've covered it and we talked around it. But okay, so assume we have enough AC top drive rigs and we have the roughnecks, the sand chiefs, the frac spreads, all of the things that are going to be needed, and the pipelines that we could put into Britain and that could go to France or to Germany, and that they said tomorrow, okay, we're repealing the frac bans, we want to start drilling. How long would it take? And assuming these supply chains and the personnel are available, how long would it take for them to really drill enough to make up for their lack of drilling over the last 2 or 3 decades?
A minimum of 2 to 3 years, but more importantly, a minimum of 2 to 3 winters.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's the peak day time period, or the peak time period when you need natural gas. George Yates is a good friend. George Yates is involved with Quadrilla. Quadrilla is the one that's trying to push the British Parliament right now to rescind the moratorium. That was all predicated on some earthquakes that they felt were related to some of the drilling in England.
Right.
But really, Robert, it's the other 6 countries that you see hardly no discussion about or recognition of what the underlying problem is, and that is they're not energy independent.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the U.S. is ever energy independent. I think there's a level of energy security that we have that's critical, that's founded on the people, what we may affectionately call the roughnecks and the redneck roughnecks and the rigs. We have that here, probably at only about 60 to 70% of the capacity we had 10 years ago. But that is the difference maker. That's why a fertilizer plant in Donaldsonville, Louisiana, can make 6 times what they typically make because of the inexpensive input cost of natural gas as it's compared to worldwide natural gas. I mean, it is so clearly obvious.
Even though we've seen a 4x increase in natural gas in the U.S.
Right. It still makes economic sense. I mean, compare our natural gas costs to Asia and Europe and tell me we did not make great decisions in the shale revolution. And so much of that was predicated on not politicians making decisions, but entrepreneurial oil and gas companies contacting private owners of oil and gas mineral rights and drilling on their lands.
Right.
That fundamental difference in our Constitution versus any other country. There isn't another country in the world that allows private citizens to own mineral rights.
Yeah.
And it's that differentiator in this whole mix of discussion that allowed for the shale revolution to occur.
Yeah. No, I agree. It also allowed the oil and gas industry to burn through $300 billion and destroy $300 billion in capital to make natural gas as cheap as it was for all these many years. And now those days are over, and we're seeing
that's an important distinction. That's an important distinction because right now the equity markets will not allow that kind of capital destruction to occur. And yet you're seeing returns for oil and gas companies right now that'll cause some of these folks that are so interested in ESG only investments to look over and say, oh my gosh, they're getting a 20-fold return over here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can talk about a friend of ours without disclosing who it is, but $10 million per employee.
Yeah. Some of the margins being made in the upstream now are just, they're jaw dropping.
Staggering.
But it's also a result of the overinvestment in the industry, and now that capital discipline is fully in place. I just wanted to just read this quick thing about Dow. This was August 9th is the date. I didn't realize it was almost 3 weeks ago. But X Energy and Dow announced a collaboration with intent to deploy an advanced small modular reactor at one of Dow's U.S. Gulf Coast facilities. The SMR, which would be operable by about 2030, would provide heat and power to the Dow facility. So X Energy is they're developing this what is it, the XE100 I think is the design, but I just find that to be really important because it's one thing for countries in Europe, and there have been a number of announcements on SMRs in Europe, but this is an American, an old line industrial company in the U.S. saying we're going to really look hard at this, which I think is really remarkable. So John, we've been talking for nearly an hour, and I have to catch a plane here in a little bit, but let me ask the questions I always ask. So what are you reading? I know you've been traveling a lot and doing a lot of speaking. In fact, you're speaking about fertilizer here in the next few days, I know, to a trade group. But what's on the top of your bookshelf or book list?
Being a junkie for your blog or for your website, your blog, and the people you introduce, this is John Constable's report.
Oh, right.
What happened in the EU. Europe's green experiment and costly failing unilateral climate policy. John is actually going to come into Denver here in a couple of weeks, and so I want to actually go through all of that. Reading a couple of other books also, but what I read are the 15 some odd reports that come in about natural gas or world markets on a daily basis. So quite honestly, I don't have a lot of time to read novels or fiction or that sort of thing. So just trying to keep abreast of what's going on in probably the most dynamic time I've seen in my 42 years for energy.
It has been. I mean, we're about the same age. We're both geezers now, firmly in the geezer class. But I don't remember a time in my lifetime, even during the OPEC embargoes, where there was so much disequilibrium that they're just, what makes sense in terms of asset classes. What does the future look like? Which economies are going to hold together? But isn't the U.S. I'll ask this question, then I have one more for you. But relative to the rest of the world, I mean, is the U.S. better off than Europe? I mean, the prospects. How do you see the prospects for the U.S. compared to the rest of the world as we look at the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, if your metric is natural gas prices, even though we're higher than we have been in the past, we're in a far better position than anyone in Asia or Europe. Robert, I looked at it 2 years ago right now. The 1 year price for natural gas in the U.S. was $2.66. 2 years ago right now. Today it's $7.70. So I say that, we're two and a half times higher than we were 2 years ago, but comparatively speaking, we're still in a better position than Europe and Asia. And we will continue to be. I think, again, if you focus on that phrase societal decay, even though it may have been a mistake to invest in the shale revolution to see the kind of capital destruction that we did, how has it changed the future of this country as compared to other countries?
Yeah.
We will not have to capitulate. I think Germany will have to capitulate to Russia and say,
and that's the suspicion.
But how do you measure that? How do you measure that?
And that's the suspicion, is that the Europeans are just going to have to give in and say, okay, well, uncle, we can't afford this anymore. So Vlad, go ahead and, Ukraine, make it your playground. We give up, which is a grim thought, but nevertheless, I mean, it may be what's required, may be what happens in terms of real politics. So last question, John, we've been talking, my guest is John John Harpole. He's the president of Mercator Energy. You can find him at mercatorenergy.com on the internet. And John and I have been good friends for a long time. What gives you hope amidst all this, John? There are a lot of things we've talked about that are very sobering here. What gives you hope?
I think a lot of people that have been on the margin in terms of understanding the impact of globalization and the campaign by climate change catastrophists. I think a lot of people have woken up to, you've got to be pragmatic about your choices related to energy, because the impact on other people, especially the middle and low income folks, can be devastating and can lead to kind of societal decay that is far worse than any potential climate change issues 50 years from now. I really hope that it makes people wake up and that you see less of this, I'm in favor of all of the above. And hey, let's be very pragmatic about our choices in electric generation. As I've said to you in the past, Robert, I'm a career-long, 42-year-long natural gas guy. We should be building every nuclear plant we can get our hands on across the world to recognize and realize energy security. But when you start to incentivize, as Texas has, as the U.S. has, certain sectors, you get, as you've always said, what you incentivize for. And those incentives so distort the marketplace that the marketplace can't function. And so this is an absolute horrible test case for poor decisions. You know, as if we look at the model of what Europe has gone through here, my hope is that because the impact is so striking, that people will wake up to perhaps a more pragmatic look at what we should do on energy choices in the future. And so I'm trying to pull a silver lining out of a very, very, very 2 to 3 year long dark cloud. But I hope that this will make people wake up. I've been asking myself for 20 years, when are people going to realize what's happening here? You know, I've been talking about Russia and the supply to Europe since 2008 and been concerned about it. And so many of my concerns are coming out to play. But I just think every politician, every elected official, from the city to the state to the county to the national to international, has really got to step back and say, what happened here, and how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? How do we ensure that we're not going to see the kind of societal decay that's inevitable for Europe over the next 2 to 3 years?
We'll stop there. Well, it's been a sobering discussion, John, but a good one. Again, my friend John Harpole, he's the president of MercatorEnergy.com. You can president of Mercator Energy. You can find him at MercatorEnergy.com. John, thanks again for coming on the Power Hungry podcast.
Good to see you, Robert. Safe travels today. Take
Thanks.
care.
And thanks to all of you in podcast land. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and make sure and tune in to the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see you.